April 30th, 1937, Maxwell Field, Alabama. The fountain pen moved slowly across the resignation paperwork. Each stroke carried the weight of 20 years in uniform. Captain Claire Lee Chennault, Chief of Pursuit Training for the United States Army Air Corps, signed away his military career at the age of 43. Officially, the reason was chronic bronchitis, ravaged lungs from years of open cockpit flying, and progressive deafness that made communication with students and fellow officers increasingly difficult. These physical ailments were real, but they served as convenient cover for an organization eager to rid itself of a persistent dissenter. The truth resided in the filing cabinets surrounding him. Memoranda arguing that fighter aircraft could intercept and destroy bomber formations. Tactical manuals detailing pursuit strategies that contradicted every assumption held by the bomber mafia dominating Air Corps thinking. Training reports showing how precision fighter tactics could devastate enemy air forces. All had been dismissed, ridiculed, or ignored by superiors who believed one inescapable doctrine: the bomber will always get through. As Chennault walked away from Maxwell Field that spring afternoon, his colleagues breathed a sigh of relief. The radical was gone. The troublemaker who refused to accept bomber supremacy had finally been forced out. What none of them could imagine was that within 5 years, this forced retirement would transform into the greatest vindication in military aviation history. The tactics once called obsolete would prove revolutionary. The dismissed theories would save China from Japanese conquest. And the fired captain would return as a major general, commanding operations that would validate everything they had deemed impossible. The seeds of Chennault's heresy had been planted in the 1920s at Hawaii. Stationed at Ford Island from 1923 to 1926 as commander of the 19th Pursuit Squadron, he spent countless hours studying fighter tactics, while the rest of the air service remained obsessed with bombardment theory. He flew mock combat missions, analyzed aerial maneuvers, and documented every engagement. In his cramped base quarters, surrounded by technical manuals and tactical diagrams, he began developing theories that would eventually revolutionize air warfare. The prevailing wisdom of the era seemed unshakable. The Martin B-10 bomber, introduced in 1932, could fly at 215 miles per hour. The Boeing P-26 fighter achieved 234 miles per hour, offering only a marginal speed advantage. Army Air Corps exercises appeared designed to prove bomber invincibility. During the 1931 maneuvers in Ohio, pursuit squadrons failed to intercept a single bomber formation in 2 weeks of intensive operations. The commanding general drew what seemed like an obvious conclusion. Due to increased speeds and limitless space, it is impossible for fighters to intercept bombers, and therefore it is inconsistent with the employment of air forces to develop fighters. The doctrine became gospel. The Air Corps Tactical School at Maxwell Field stopped teaching fighter tactics entirely in 1936. Resources flowed exclusively toward bombardment development. The age of the invincible bomber had arrived, but Chennault refused to accept this conclusion. He had studied those Ohio exercises with forensic intensity. The conditions had been rigged. Pursuit squadrons were given inadequate warning time, insufficient altitude, and deliberately handicapped communication systems. When Chennault ran his own tactical experiments with the 19th Pursuit Squadron under realistic combat conditions and proper coordination, His fighters intercepted bomber formations with devastating effectiveness. His observations convinced him that bomber advocates were making fatal assumptions. They presumed that pursuit aircraft would engage in individual dogfighting, the aerial jousting that characterized World War I combat over the Western Front. Chennault saw this as medieval thinking applied to modern warfare. Fighters needed to operate in coordinated pairs and larger formations. They needed early warning systems to achieve advantageous positioning. They needed tactics that exploited their strengths while avoiding vulnerable turning battles. In 1929, Chennault was promoted to captain. By 1931, he had graduated from the Air Corps Tactical School at Langley Field, Virginia. His instructors kept him at Langley as a faculty member teaching pursuit tactics. It should have been the beginning of a prestigious career. Instead, it marked the start of his exile. At Langley, and later at Maxwell Field, Chennault found himself swimming against an overwhelming tide. The tactical school had become the intellectual headquarters of bomber theory. Faculty members were developing doctrine that would define Air Corps thinking for the next decade. Strategic bombardment would destroy enemy industrial capacity. High-altitude precision bombing would devastate military production. No defensive measures could stop determined bomber formations from reaching their targets. Chennault's contrary arguments earned him the nickname Radical Chennault. He insisted loudly and persistently that well-trained pursuit squadrons using proper tactics could shatter bomber formations. His personality, gruff, uncompromising, and intolerant of intellectual laziness, made him few friends among the officer corps. When he published his textbook, The Role of Defensive Pursuit, in 1935, it should have established his reputation as a forward-thinking tactician. Instead, it marked him as someone unwilling to accept institutional wisdom. In June 1936, at Maxwell Field, Chennault received promotion to major. It would be his last. By early 1937, his health problems provided convenient cover for an organization eager to remove him. When he signed those retirement papers on April 30th, 1937, most Air Corps officers considered it good riddance. The tactical school could now teach bombardment theory without interference. The future belonged to the bomber, and the future had no place for Claire Chennault. Yet even as Chennault cleared out his Maxwell Field office, events on the other side of the Pacific were proving his theories correct. On July 7, 1937, Japanese and Chinese troops exchanged fire at the Marco Polo Bridge near Beijing, an incident that escalated into full-scale war within weeks. The Second Sino-Japanese War had begun, and it would become the laboratory where Chennault's dismissed tactics would finally receive their battlefield test. Chennault had arrived in China just weeks earlier, hired on a 3-month contract at $1,000 per month to survey the Chinese Air Force for Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek and his wife, Song Mei-ling, Madame Chiang. What he found shocked him. The Chinese Air Force possessed obsolete aircraft, inadequately trained pilots, and no coherent tactical doctrine. When Japanese forces launched their invasion, Chinese air resistance collapsed almost instantly. The Japanese enjoyed overwhelming advantages. Their Mitsubishi A-5M fighter dominated Chinese skies with superior speed, maneuverability, and experienced pilots. Japanese bomber formations raided Chinese cities with impunity. Within months, Japan controlled Chinese airspace across the eastern provinces. But Chennault saw opportunity in this disaster. China desperately needed effective air. He studied Japanese aircraft and tactics with meticulous detail, identifying strengths to avoid and weaknesses to exploit. By 1940, Chennault recognized that Chinese pilots alone could not stem the Japanese onslaught. He needed experienced combat aviators who understood his methods. He needed aircraft capable of matching Japanese fighters. Most importantly, he needed official American support without dragging the United States into war before the nation was ready. In October 1940, with Chiang Kai-shek's blessing, Chennault returned to America with an audacious proposal. President Franklin D. Roosevelt faced a delicate situation. American public opinion remained staunchly isolationist, yet Roosevelt recognized that Japanese expansion threatened American interests throughout Asia. Chennault's proposal offered an elegant solution. Recruit American military pilots who would resign their commissions to become civilian volunteers. Purchase fighter aircraft from American manufacturers for transfer to the Chinese Air Force. The arrangement provided plausible deniability while allowing substantial American assistance to Chinese resistance. Chennault faced enormous challenges recruiting pilots. Active duty military aviators earned stable salaries with clear career paths. Chennault offered one-year contracts in a combat zone halfway around the world, fighting an experienced enemy with unfamiliar aircraft. The financial incentives needed to be substantial. Pilots would receive salaries ranging from $600 monthly for wingmen to $750 for squadron commanders. More importantly, they would receive $500 bonuses for every Japanese aircraft destroyed. For young aviators looking at decades of peacetime military service, DAUNT. The opportunity to see real combat while making substantial money proved irresistible. 100 pilots eventually signed contracts. They came from Navy fighter squadrons, Marine Corps aviation units, and Army Air Corps pursuit groups. Many were skilled but difficult personalities, men whose aggressive tendencies made them poor fits for peacetime military discipline. They were exactly the type of pilots Chennault needed. The aircraft arrived first. 100 Curtiss P-40B and P-40C Warhawk fighters, purchased by the Chinese government from American production lines, originally intended for the Royal Air Force. The P-40 was already considered obsolete by American standards. In 1941, American procurement officers were focused on newer designs, like the P-38 Lightning and the P-47 Thunderbolt. The P-40 lacked the maneuverability of Japanese fighters, particularly the legendary Mitsubishi A6M0. Its Allison V1710 engine produced 1,040 horsepower in the early B-model variants, significantly less than more advanced designs entering service. At high altitudes above 15,000 feet, where thin air reduced engine performance, the P-40's capabilities degraded substantially. Japanese fighters could outclimb and outturn it at almost any altitude. But Chennault understood something American procurement officers had missed. The P-40 possessed specific advantages that could be decisive under proper tactical employment. Its airframe was rugged and heavily built, capable of sustaining battle damage that would destroy lighter Japanese aircraft. Pilots reported absorbing hits from 20mm cannon shells and 50 caliber rounds that would have torn apart a Zero, yet bringing their P-40s home. The aircraft's armored cockpit and self-sealing fuel tanks, features Japanese designers had sacrificed for performance and range, saved American lives repeatedly. It carried 650 caliber Browning M2 machine guns, 3 in each wing, with heavy ammunition loads exceeding 200 rounds per gun. This was devastating firepower by the standards of early World War II. A single P-40 could deliver more weight of fire than most enemy fighters. When multiple P-40s concentrated their fire on a single target, as Chennault's tactics demanded, the results were catastrophic. for whatever aircraft found itself in the cone of fire. Japanese bombers, unarmored and carrying volatile fuel and munitions, typically disintegrated under sustained 50 caliber fire. Most importantly for Chennault's tactics, the P-40 could achieve tremendous speed in diving attacks. The robust airframe and relatively heavy weight that made it sluggish in climbs and turns became advantages in dives. Pilots reported achieving speeds in excess of 450 miles per hour in steep dives, far exceeding what Japanese meant. Fighters could match without risking structural failure. This speed differential was the key to Chennault's entire tactical system. Attack from above. Dive through the target at speeds the enemy cannot match. Extend away before the enemy can respond. Climb back to altitude outside their range. Repeat. The P-40 was purpose-built for this style of warfare, even if its designers had not recognized it. The pilots began arriving in Burma in the summer of 1941. They came in small groups traveling circuitous routes on civilian transport ships, carrying forged paperwork identifying them as teachers, missionaries, and businessmen. The journey itself was arduous. Men accustomed to military discipline found themselves traveling as civilians through the Panama Canal, across the Pacific to Southeast Asia. Some took months to reach their destination. They arrived at Toungoo Airfield in central Burma to conditions far removed from comfortable American air bases. The airfield sat in jungle territory, surrounded by oppressive heat and fierce mosquitoes. Living quarters consisted of grass huts with minimal amenities. Food was often marginal. Medical facilities were primitive. Many pilots suffered from dysentery, malaria, and heat exhaustion within weeks of arrival. Yet Chennault pushed them through the most intensive training program any American pilots had yet experienced. He drilled one set of tactics relentlessly. Never engage Japanese fighters in turning combat. The Zero and Oscar possessed superior maneuverability. Any attempt at classic dogfighting would be suicide. Always maintain altitude advantage before attacking. Fights were won before the first shot was fired through proper positioning. Fight in pairs with mutual support. The wingman system Chennault developed would become standard throughout American fighter aviation. Use diving attacks to exploit the P-40's superior speed and firepower. Make slashing runs through enemy formations. Then use diving speed to disengage before Japanese fighters could respond. Never linger. Never turn back for a second pass from the same angle. Climb back to altitude outside enemy range and repeat the process from a different vector. The tactics contradicted everything most pilots had learned in military flight training. Conventional pursuit doctrine emphasized dogfighting, individual aerial combat, showcasing pilot skill and aircraft maneuverability. Chennault's approach seemed cowardly to some pilots, raised on romanticized notions of aerial chivalry. They wanted to engage in turning battles to prove their superiority in direct competition. Chennault would have none of it. This is not sport, he told them repeatedly. This is killing. He showed them gun camera footage from Chinese pilots who had engaged Japanese fighters conventionally. The results were invariably the same. The Chinese aircraft, attempting to turn with more maneuverable opponents, would lose energy and altitude. Within seconds, a Japanese fighter would be on their tail. Within seconds more, the Chinese pilot was dead. Chennault forced his pilots to watch these films repeatedly until the lesson became visceral. Fight the way I teach you, or die the way they did. But Chennault was not merely training pilots to survive. He was preparing them to kill Japanese airmen and destroy Japanese aircraft as efficiently as possible. His tactics maximized the P-40's strengths while completely negating Japanese advantages. The Zero's legendary maneuverability meant nothing if it never got close enough to use it. The Japanese pilot's superior experience meant nothing if he never saw the attack coming. More importantly, these were tactics Chennault had been developing for 15 years while the Air Corps ignored him. Now, in the jungles of Burma, far from the bureaucrats who had forced him to retire, he would finally prove they worked. Chennault also established an early warning system that would prove as valuable as his tactical training. Using radio equipment and Chinese volunteers, he created a network of spotters stretching across hundreds of miles of territory. Observers in caves and hilltops would listen for approaching aircraft, estimate their numbers and direction, then relay information to AVG headquarters. The system gave Chennault's fighters precious minutes of warning, time to climb to advantageous altitude before Japanese formations arrived. It was primitive compared to radar, but in the context of China's technological limitations, it was revolutionary. By December 1941, the American Volunteer Group had organized into 3 squadrons. The 1st Pursuit Squadron, Adam and Eve's, commanded by Robert Neal. The 2nd Pursuit Squadron, Panda Bears, led by Jack Newkirk. And the 3rd Pursuit Squadron, Hell's Angels, under Arvid Olsen. They had approximately 82 trained pilots and 62 combat-ready P-40 fighters based between Kunming in southern China and Rangoon in Burma. They were not yet the Flying Tigers. That name would come later. The pilots simply called themselves the AVG. December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The Japanese surprise attack destroyed much of the U.S. Pacific Fleet and killed over 2,400 servicemen. Across the Pacific, Japanese forces launched simultaneous assaults on American, British, and Dutch possessions. The Japanese military offensive rolled forward with devastating effectiveness. American morale sank to depths not seen since the Civil War. Americans desperately needed good news, any evidence that the United States could stroke back. December 20th, 1941, Kunming, China. The early warning network that Chennault had spent months developing detected Japanese bomber formations approaching from Indochina. 10 Mitsubishi Ki-21 Sally bombers departed Hanoi Airfield on what they expected to be a routine raid. For a year, they had bombed Kunming with impunity. The Japanese crews anticipated another unopposed mission. Chennault's warning network provided critical advance notice. Ground observers in caves surrounding Kunming reported aircraft engine sounds while the bombers were still miles away. Radio operators transmitted warnings to AVG headquarters. By the time Japanese formations approached the city, 18 P-40 Warhawks were climbing to intercept altitude under radio direction from Chennault on the ground. The Hell's Angels squadron struck first. The P-40s dove through the formation at speeds the Japanese could not match, destroying bombers before escorting fighters could respond. The Americans climbed away, reformed, and attacked again. 4 Japanese bombers went down in flames. 3 others suffered crippling damage. The remaining bombers jettisoned their loads and fled. Chinese citizens watching from Kunming witnessed Japanese aircraft falling from the sky for the first time in the war. Chennault met the returning P-40s on the runway. His face showed no emotion as pilots climbed from their cockpits. It was a good job, he told them, but not good enough. Next time, get them all. The statement captured Chennault's perfectionism perfectly. 4 confirmed kills was impressive, but 6 bombers had escaped. 3 days later, the Japanese returned in force. 63 bombers escorted by 25 Nakajima Ki-43 Oscar fighters approached Rangoon, Burma. This time, the Japanese came prepared for opposition. They had received reports about the mysterious fighters that had savaged their Kunming raid. They brought overwhelming numbers to ensure success. 14 AVG P-40s rose to meet them, joined by 15 Royal Air Force Brewster Buffalo fighters. The odds were nearly 3-1 against the defenders. Conventional wisdom suggested the Japanese would overwhelm the outnumbered Allied fighters through sheer weight of numbers. The battle raged across the skies above Rangoon for over an hour, becoming the first major test of Chennault's tactical theories against a prepared enemy. AVG pilots executed his methods with precision that would have made their commander proud. Robert Neal led the Adam and Eve squadron in the initial attack. They had climbed to altitude while the Japanese formations were still approaching, using the early warning system to position themselves perfectly. When Neal gave the signal, his squadron dove through the Japanese bomber formation from 12,000 feet, achieving speeds that made interception impossible. The P-40's 6.50 caliber machine guns concentrated devastating firepower on the unarmored bombers. Each burst from a single P-40 delivered more than 300 rounds per minute, more than 40 pounds of lead and steel every 60 seconds. Japanese bombers, designed for range and payload rather than protection, could not withstand such punishment. Within the first pass, 3 bombers were falling in flames. The P-40s did not linger. Following Chennault's doctrine precisely, they dove completely through the formation, using their speed to open distance from the Japanese escorts, then climbed back to altitude outside the enemy's engagement range. The Japanese escorts, attempting to defend their charges, found themselves unable to catch the diving P-40s. When they tried to pursue, the Americans simply accelerated away. When the Oscars attempted to climb back to the bomber formation, the P-40s had already repositioned for another attack. It was aerial warfare as an engineering problem, not as romantic aerial jousting. The Americans held every advantage because Chennault had designed the tactics to ensure they would. The Royal Air Force Buffaloes, meanwhile, engaged using conventional fighter tactics. British pilots trained in traditions that emphasized individual combat and maneuverability contests entered turning battles with the Japanese escorts. The results were predictable and tragic. The Brewster Buffalo, already obsolete when it entered service, could not match the Oscar in turning performance. Japanese pilots, with years of combat experience, systematically destroyed the British fighters. The contrast between the AVG's success and the RAF's casualties provided brutal validation of Chennault's methods. By the time the Japanese formations withdrew, they had lost over 30 aircraft to all causes. The 62nd Sentai, one of the elite Japanese bomber units, was effectively destroyed as a combat force. The Japanese lost aircraft, experienced crews, and most importantly, their sense of invulnerability. The AVG lost 3 P-40s in combat and had 2 destroyed on the ground by bombing. British Buffaloes suffered severe casualties. The contrast between American and British losses, using different tactical approaches against the same enemy, could not have been more stark. News of the Christmas Day air battle reached American newspapers within days. Editors desperate for positive stories found perfect material in this exotic volunteer group. Life magazine sent photographers. Time magazine dispatched correspondents. Henry Luce, the influential publisher with personal connections to China, devoted extensive coverage to Chennault and his aviators. Someone at Time coined the name Flying Tigers. Disney Studios produced a logo. The AVG pilots, meanwhile, had already adopted shark mouth nose art on their aircraft, inspired by Royal Air Force P-40s serving in North Africa. The combination of name and visual brand created instant recognition. Claire Chennault became America's first military hero of World War II. Newspapers ran stories about the leather-faced commander who had been forced out of the Air Corps but was now leading American pilots to victory. The irony was not lost on Chennault. 5 years earlier, the Air Corps had dismissed him as a troublemaker with obsolete ideas. Now those same ideas were producing the only good news in a war filled with American defeats. Over the following months, the Flying Tigers compiled a combat record that remains legendary. Operating from bases in Burma and southern China, the 3 squadrons flew against Japanese forces that outnumbered them 20-1. They never had more than 50 combat-ready aircraft at any given time. Personnel shortages meant pilots flew multiple missions daily, accumulating fatigue that would have grounded them under normal circumstances. They often faced severe shortages of spare parts, with ground crews cannibalizing damaged aircraft to keep others flying. Ammunition supplies ran low repeatedly. Fuel had to be flown over dangerous mountain routes from India. The logistics situation grew increasingly desperate as Japanese forces cut that route as well. The AVG operated on razor-thin margins, one bad day away from being unable to continue operations. Yet Chennault's training produced results that defied the numerical odds and logistical nightmares. His pilots learned to make every bullet count, every sortie matter. They operated with precision born of necessity, knowing that wasted ammunition or damaged aircraft could mean the difference between success and failure. The early warning system gave them the ability to choose their battles, engaging when conditions favored them, declining combat when they did not. This was not cowardice, Chennault insisted. It was intelligent use of limited resources. The tactical success manifested in specific engagements throughout the spring of 1942. In January, over Rangoon, 6 P-40s intercepted a formation of bombers and fighters and shot down 4 without loss. In March, Flying Tigers defended the vital Salween River Gorge, where retreating Chinese forces had blown the bridge to slow Japanese pursuit. For 4 days, AVG pilots flew continuous missions, destroying Japanese trucks and preventing bridge repair, buying time for Chinese forces to establish defensive positions. In May, they provided air cover for the British retreat from Burma, giving ground forces breathing room that saved thousands of lives. By July 4, 1942, when the AVG officially disbanded, the unit had been credited with 296 Japanese aircraft destroyed. Modern historical research suggests this figure, like most wartime aerial victory claims, included overclaiming common to all air forces in the era of high-speed combat without reliable confirmation methods. Even accounting for this, the Flying Tigers' actual accomplishment remained extraordinary. The unit lost 14 pilots killed in combat, and another 9 in accidents. The credited kill ratio exceeded 20-1, an achievement unmatched by any other American unit in the early war period. Individual pilots became aces and earned their Places in aviation history. Robert Neal, commander of the 1st Pursuit Squadron, shot down 16 Japanese aircraft and became the AVG's leading ace. His leadership in combat matched his tactical skill. Pilots who flew with him described a commander who remained calm under fire, made quick decisions based on Chennault's principles, and brought his pilots home alive. Neal's success vindicated Chennault's selection of squadron leaders based on judgment and tactical ability rather than seniority alone. David Lee Hill, the Texan who became squadron leader of the 2nd Pursuit Squadron, destroyed over a dozen enemy planes and continued serving after the AVG disbanded. Hill was among the handful of pilots who chose to join the regular Army Air Forces when the volunteer group ended, providing continuity and institutional knowledge to the 23rd Fighter Group that replaced the AVG. His memoir of Flying Tiger operations would later become one of the definitive first-hand accounts of the unit's combat. Experiences. Charles Older, Robert Prescott, and George Burgard each compiled double-digit scores, joining an elite group of American aces who achieved their status in the war's opening months when Japanese forces seemed unstoppable everywhere else. These men proved that properly trained pilots using correct tactics could defeat enemy forces regardless of numerical odds or the enemy's reputation. Their success was not individual brilliance, though they were skilled aviators. Their success came from rigorous application of Chennault's tactical doctrines in the face of overwhelming opposition. Even average pilots achieved extraordinary results using Chennault's methods. Men who might have been competent but unremarkable fighter pilots using conventional tactics became deadly effective when employing the hit-and-run approach Chennault demanded. The tactics leveled the playing field, allowing pilots of moderate skill to survive and succeed against more experienced opponents. This democratization of fighter combat effectiveness would become one of Chennault's most important contributions. Good tactics, properly applied, could make average pilots dangerous and great pilots unstoppable. The Japanese learned to fear encounters with the shark-mouthed P-40s. After the initial Kunming raid, Japanese bombers never again attempted to attack the city while the Flying Tigers defended it. Chennault had done something revolutionary in air warfare. He had developed tactics specifically designed to negate enemy advantages while maximizing friendly strengths. The Japanese possessed superior fighter aircraft and more experienced pilots. Chennault made these advantages irrelevant by refusing to fight the kind of battle where they mattered. His pilots fought at altitudes and speeds where P-40 capabilities dominated. They turned combat into an engineering problem rather than a test of aerial artistry. The validation extended beyond tactical success. On April 15, 1942, as the AVG continued operations, the United States Army Air Forces recalled Chennault to active duty with the rank of colonel. 8 days later, on April 23rd, he received promotion to brigadier general. The rapid advancement was unprecedented. Chennault had jumped from retired major to brigadier general in barely 2 weeks. The promotions acknowledged something the Air Force's brass had finally recognized. Chennault had been right. In July 1942, the AVG officially disbanded and was absorbed into the United States Army Air Forces as the 23rd Fighter Group within the newly formed China Air Task Force. Most AVG pilots chose not to continue, but Chennault stayed, now commanding regular military units in addition to training new pilots arriving from the States. In March 1943, Chennault received promotion to Major General and assumed command of the 14th Air Force, responsible for all American air operations in China. At age 49, just 6 years after forced retirement, he commanded approximately 700 aircraft at peak strength. Despite being the smallest American Air Force operating in any combat theater, hampered by severe supply constraints from flying materials over the hump from India, the 14th Air Force punched far above its weight. The supply situation was desperate. Every gallon of fuel, every bullet, every spare part had to be flown from India over the Himalayan mountains in transport aircraft facing horrific weather, primitive navigation aids, and Japanese fighters. Pilots called it flying the hump, and it was among the most dangerous flying in the war. Hundreds of aircraft and crews were lost to weather, mountains, and enemy action. The tonnage that arrived in China never matched the tonnage needed. Chennault operated under constraints that would have been considered impossible by commanders in other theaters. Yet he made it work through tactical brilliance and operational efficiency. The 14th Air Force focused on targets that produced maximum results for minimum expenditure. Japanese shipping in coastal waters and rivers, supply depots and logistics bases, airfields and aircraft on the ground. Chennault avoided the kind of strategic bombing campaigns that consumed enormous resources for uncertain results. Instead, he waged tactical warfare that directly supported Chinese ground forces and directly damaged Japanese capabilities. The results spoke for themselves. The 14th Air Force would ultimately destroy over 2,300 Japanese aircraft before war's end. According to official United States Air Force records, they sank dozens of Japanese ships, destroyed hundreds of locomotives and thousands of trucks, and demolished countless supply dumps. They did this with a force that never exceeded 700 aircraft and often operated with far fewer due to maintenance requirements and combat losses. Chennault's forces operated under conditions that would have been considered impossible by the bomber advocates who had forced him to retire. The transformation was complete. The troublemaker had become a major general. The radical had become a theater commander. The officer forced out for refusing to accept bomber supremacy now commanded one of America's most successful air forces. Every prediction he had made, every tactical concept he had developed, every argument he had advanced during those frustrating years at Maxwell Field had been proven correct through combat. The irony extended throughout the air forces and became impossible to ignore. The bomber doctrine that had dominated American air power thinking in the 1930s had proven catastrophically flawed in actual combat. Unescorted bombers flying deep into enemy territory suffered unsustainable casualties in both European and Pacific theaters. The theory that bombers would always get through collapsed under the reality of determined fighter opposition. The 8th Air Force bombing campaign over Germany provided the most devastating evidence. In August 1943, during raids on the Schweinfurt ball bearing factories and Regensburg aircraft plants, the 8th Air Force lost 60 bombers out of 376 dispatched, a 16% loss rate in a single day. In October 1943, a second Schweinfurt raid lost 60 more bombers, another devastating blow. Crews flying unescorted bombers over Germany faced statistical certainty of death or capture before completing their 25 mission tours. The losses were unsustainable. The bomber offensive threatened to collapse entirely. The solution came from the weapons system the Air Corps had nearly eliminated: fighters. Long-range escort fighters, particularly the P-51 Mustang, with its ability to accompany bombers all the way to Berlin and back, transformed the bombing campaign. German fighters, which had torn apart unescorted bomber formations with impunity, found themselves engaged by American fighters that could match them in performance and outnumber them through sheer production. The bomber offensive succeeded not because bombers were invulnerable, but because fighters protected them. Everything Chennault had argued in the 1930s had been proven correct in the blood of bomber crews over Germany. Fighters, the aircraft type that Chennault had championed while the Air Corps ignored him, became the key to winning air superiority in every theater. Chennault watched these developments with satisfaction, but little surprise. He had tried to warn his superiors. He had argued that bomber invincibility was fantasy. He had insisted that fighters were essential for both offensive and defensive operations. They had called him obsolete and forced him out. Now combat had proven every word correct. His validation came with costs. Throughout the war, Chennault feuded constantly with General Joseph Stilwell, the American ground commander in China. Their disagreements over strategy and resource allocation grew so bitter that Chennault repeatedly bypassed the chain of command, dealing directly with Chiang Kai-shek and President Roosevelt. Stilwell wanted resources devoted to training and equipping Chinese ground forces for a campaign to reopen land supply routes through northern Burma. Chennault insisted that air power, properly supplied, could accomplish far more with far less. The debate became personal, with Stilwell considering Chennault an insubordinate prima donna and Chennault viewing Stilwell as a hidebound, conventional thinker. Such behavior earned Chennault enemies among senior Air Force leadership, including General Henry Hap Arnold, who commanded the Army Air Forces and had little patience for theater commanders who circumvented proper channels. The tension came to a head in 1944 when Arnold, frustrated by Chennault's constant end runs around Stilwell, began questioning whether the 14th Air Force commander should remain in position. Chennault survived, partly through his results and partly through his connections to the White House and Chinese government, but the damage to his relationships with senior leadership was permanent. When the war ended in August 1945, Chennault retired again with an extraordinary combat record, but burned bridges with many colleagues in the Air Force hierarchy. He had been proven right on tactics and strategy, but his methods of achieving recognition had cost him the institutional support that might have led to higher command positions in the post-war Air Force. On October 8, 1945, he left military service for the second and final time. Chennault did not fade into quiet retirement. In 1946, he returned to China and established Civil Air Transport, CAT, an airline that would play a significant role in the Chinese Civil War and later covert operations throughout Asia. CAT flew supplies to nationalist forces fighting the communist insurgency, conducted relief operations, and undertook missions that ranged from legitimate commerce to intelligence operations. When the communists won the Chinese Civil War in 1949, CAT relocated to Taiwan and continued operations throughout Asia. The airline was eventually purchased by the Central Intelligence Agency and became part of the operation known as Air America, playing controversial roles in conflicts across Southeast Asia through the 1970s. On July 18, 1958, just days before his death from lung cancer at age 64, the Air Force granted him honorary promotion to lieutenant general. The promotion came too late for Chennault to fully appreciate it. He died 9 days later, on July 27, 1958, in New Orleans, Louisiana. He was buried with full military honors at Arlington National Cemetery, the troublemaker finally receiving the recognition that had been denied him for so much of his career. But Chennault's true legacy was not measured in rank or official recognition. It was written in the tactical manuals that adopted his methods wholesale. It lived in the pursuit squadrons that flew his techniques throughout the war and for decades afterward. It existed in the thousands of enemy aircraft destroyed by pilots trained in tactics that traced their lineage directly to what Chennault had developed in the jungles of Burma and the skies over China. The tactical principles Chennault developed became the foundation of American fighter doctrine and remain so through the jet age and into the missile era. His emphasis on altitude advantage before engagement became standard practice taught to every fighter pilot from World War II through Vietnam and beyond. His insistence on mutual support tactics and wingman coordination became the basis for the two-ship and four-ship formations that dominated fighter operations for the rest of the century. His doctrine of refusing disadvantageous engagements and exploiting aircraft strengths while avoiding weaknesses became the intellectual foundation of fighter tactics development. When the Air Force wrote its fighter manuals in the decades after World War II, they were writing Chennault's ideas. The influence extended beyond tactics to strategy. Chennault's emphasis on tactical air power directly supporting ground forces became the model for close air support doctrine. His focus on achieving maximum effect from minimum resources anticipated the efficiency requirements that would dominate air operations in Korea, Vietnam, and beyond. His insistence that air power could be decisive when properly employed and adequately supplied prefigured debates about air power's role that continue to this day. The arguments Chennault made in the 1930s about the primacy of fighters and the vulnerability of bombers shaped air power thinking for generations. His emphasis on early warning systems and integrated air defense, primitive though his methods were compared to later technology, established principles that would become fundamental to Cold War air defense networks. The concept of using ground observers and radio communications to vector fighters to intercepts became the basis for the radar-directed interception systems that protected American airspace for decades. What Chennault had cobbled together with radios and Chinese volunteers in 1941 became in more sophisticated form the SAGE system and the network of radar stations that ringed North America during the Cold War. The training methods Chennault developed, emphasizing realistic combat conditions and scenarios specifically designed to exploit friendly strengths against enemy weaknesses, became templates for fighter weapons schools and tactical training programs. The Navy's Top Gun program, established in 1969 after unacceptable losses in Vietnam, drew directly on principles Chennault had established. The Air Force's Red Flag exercises, creating realistic combat scenarios to train pilots before they faced actual combat, reflected Chennault's emphasis on tough training producing combat effectiveness. Fighter pilots decades later were using methods Chennault had pioneered. The Flying Tigers flew combat missions for only 7 months, from December 1941 to July 1942. But those 7 months changed air warfare forever and established principles that would endure for decades. They proved that fighter tactics could be revolutionary when they broke from conventional thinking. They demonstrated that a small force, using superior techniques and proper preparation, could defeat much larger enemies with superior equipment. They showed that the officer the Air Corps had dismissed as obsolete possessed an understanding of aerial combat that surpassed everyone who had forced him to retire. The broader implications extended beyond tactics to institutional culture and military innovation. The story exposed how large organizations, particularly military establishments in peacetime, can become resistant to innovation that challenges established doctrine. The Air Corps of the 1930s had invested enormous intellectual and material capital in bomber theory. Admitting that fighters might be equally or more important would have required acknowledging that strategic assumptions underlying years of planning and billions of dollars of procurement had been wrong. Institutions resist such admissions. It is easier to force out the dissenter than to re-examine the doctrine. Chennault's eventual vindication proved that institutional consensus, no matter how overwhelming, is not the same as truth. The entire Air Corps leadership, with only a handful of exceptions, believed bomber theory was correct in the 1930s. They were wrong. Chennault, isolated and ridiculed, was right. Combat, the ultimate arbiter of military theories, proved it beyond any doubt. This lesson resonates beyond aviation, beyond the military, to any field where established wisdom resists challenge from unconventional thinkers. The story also demonstrates the importance of testing theories under realistic conditions. Chennault's skepticism about bomber invincibility stemmed from his analysis of rigged exercises but stacked conditions to favor predetermined outcomes. When he conducted exercises under realistic conditions, his fighters consistently intercepted the bombers. The Air Corps leadership preferred exercises that confirmed their theories rather than experiments that might challenge them. This confirmation bias, the tendency to seek information that supports existing beliefs while ignoring contradictory evidence, nearly cost America dearly in World War II. The human cost of institutional resistance became clear in the blood of bomber crews over Germany. Thousands of American airmen died in unescorted bombing missions because Air Corps planners had assured them fighters were unnecessary. Those deaths were preventable. If Chennault's warnings had been heeded in the 1930s, if the Air Corps had developed long-range escort fighters earlier, if bomber doctrine had been tempered with realistic assessment of fighter threats, American losses might have been substantially lower. Institutional resistance to uncomfortable truths has consequences measured in lives. When Captain Claire Lee Chennault signed those retirement papers at Maxwell Field in April 1937, he walked away from a 20-year career with nothing to show but rejection and failure. When Major General Claire Lee Chennault relinquished command of the 14th Air Force in August 1945, he left behind a tactical legacy that would influence air power for generations. The obsolete tactics had proven revolutionary. The forced retiree had been completely vindicated, and the Flying Tigers had written one of the great stories in military history, proving that sometimes the troublemakers are right and the institution is wrong.